"Ride behind me now," said the trapper when her in-laws sold her wedding ring for rum. The ring was already gone when I found her. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was there was a woman sitting on a split-rail fence at the edge of the Hollowell property, with a flour sack tied at her feet, and her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a stage that wasn't coming. Snow had started up maybe an hour before, the dry, fine kind that doesn't pile but gets into everything, into the crease of your collar and the gap at your wrist, and she hadn't moved to pull her shawl tighter. I'd been coming down out of the high country for 3 days. Beaver season was done, and I had a good pack, and I wanted nothing more than to get to Morrow's trading post and be shut of the cold. I had a mule named Chalk and a horse named Duff, and I rode Duff with Chalk behind me on a lead, and we had been down this road before, the two of us, autumn after autumn, and nothing on it ever warranted a second look. She did. Not because she was pretty, though she was, because of the flour sack, because of the way she sat like she'd made a decision that used up every last thing in her and was now simply waiting for what came next. I pulled up. Duff blew through his nose and shook his head once and settled. The woman looked at me without surprise, which told me she'd heard me coming and had made up her mind not to run. I said, "You waiting on somebody?" She said no. Said it plain, not rude. Just honest in the way that people get when they're past being careful about how they come across. I looked at the house. A Hollowell place. I knew it by the tin roof patch they'd put on the south corner years back and never replaced proper, and by the listing posture of the porch rail, which had been loose since before I ever came down this road. Smoke from the chimney. The sound of men inside, a bottle being set down hard on a table, a chair pushed back. Laughter of a particular kind, the kind that isn't about anything funny. I said, "You live here." Lived? She looked down at her hands a moment. The knuckles were red from the cold. "My husband was Court Hollowell. He died in August. Fever." I took that in. Court Hollowell I'd known by sight, younger than me by 15 years, soft-spoken, worked a small trapline in the eastern draws. I'd traded with him twice, maybe 3 times, and he had been fair both times, which wasn't a thing I could say about every man I'd ever traded with. His father was Amos Hollowell, a dried-up old stick of a man with small eyes who could find an insult in a compliment, and usually did. His brothers were Deke and Perry, and none of the 3 of them were worth the boot leather it took to walk away from them. I said, "And they're putting you out." She didn't answer that directly. She said, "They told me this morning the property was Court's father's and I had no claim, which is the law, I suppose." A pause, small and precisely placed. "They also sold my wedding ring, yesterday, to the man at the assay." The way she said it wasn't bitter. That was what got me. Not fury, not tears. The voice of someone who had looked at a thing straight and decided to keep breathing anyway. I sat there on Duff with the snow coming sideways off the ridge, and I thought about Morrow's trading post and my pack of beaver, and the cot I kept in the room above the post where I wintered most years. I thought about how this road went south and Morrow's was 3 hours south, and there was no reason to be involved in another man's family business. I said, "I'm going to Morrow's, 3 hours south. There's a woman there, Hattie Morrow, runs the dry goods half. She'll know what's available in town for work." The woman looked at me. She had dark eyes and a red mark high on her left cheek where, I would later understand, Perry Hollowell had put his hand when she'd asked about the ring. I didn't know it then. I thought it was the cold and the wind. She said, "I don't know you." I said, "No, you don't." I reached back and pulled a second bedroll off Chalk's pack, one I always carried spare for exactly the kind of country that didn't forgive you for being underprepared, and held it out to her. "But it's 20 degrees and dropping, and your choices are slim." She looked at the bedroll for a moment. Then she took it. She stood up, picked up her flour sack, and looked at me with those straight dark eyes. I said, "Ride behind me now," and I stepped Duff sideways to the fence so she could use the top rail to get up. She swung up behind me without a word. She didn't put her arms around my waist right off. She held the back of my coat instead, two fists in the canvas, and I felt the small weight of her settle and shift as Duff found his footing on the road. We rode. Her name was Ada. Ada Crane before she married Court, and she told me so about a mile down the road in the same plain way she told me everything, like she was filing a report, and wanted to make sure the facts were recorded correctly. Her people were from Missouri. She'd come west at 19 with a wagon train that lost its scout to a raid in the Panhandle, and limped into the territory 8 months later with half its number sick and the other half aged 10 years by what they'd seen. She'd met Court at a church social in Deering and married him 6 weeks later, which she said without apology. 6 weeks had seemed long enough, and for the most part she'd been right. She'd spent 3 years on the Hollowell property raising chickens and a kitchen garden, and keeping her own counsel about what she heard through the walls at night. She said all of it looking straight ahead over my shoulder, her voice low and close to my ear against the wind. I said, "What happened to your face?" Long pause, long enough I thought maybe she wasn't going to answer. "Perry," she said, "when I asked about the ring." I didn't say anything, I kept riding. But I made a note of it the way I made notes of things in the mountains, the placement of a deadfall, the depth of a ford in high water, the way a particular ridge changed in bad weather. Filed it. Kept it. My name is Lyle Brandt. I was 44 years old that winter, and I had been trapping the high country above the Morrow Valley for going on 16 years. I knew that country the way you know a thing you've lived inside of its moods and its cruelty, and the particular beauty it had in October when the aspens turned, and the sky was so blue it almost hurt. I was good at it, the trapping. Not because I was exceptional, but because I paid attention and I was patient and I didn't try to rush the mountain. I had a wife once, a long time back, Helena, who died of childbed fever in the spring of 1861, taking the baby with her. I didn't talk about it much. I didn't talk much about anything in those years. I had Chalk and Duff and my line, and I had Hattie Morrow who fed me soup when I came in off the mountain and didn't pry and didn't make a fuss about my silences. I had the cot above the post, and the mountain in summer and fall, and the post in the deep of winter, and that was the shape of my life, and I had made my peace with it. I hadn't counted on Ada Crane Hollowell. We got to Morrow's just after dark, the last stretch of road lit gray by the snow. Hattie came out with a lantern when she heard Duff in the yard, and held it up and took one look at Ada behind me on the horse, and then looked at me with that particular Hattie expression that said she'd seen stranger things but not many. She didn't say anything. She got Ada inside and got her warm and put food in front of her and a blanket around her shoulders and asked her one question. Did she have kin she could go to? Ada said no. Hattie looked at me over Ada's head, and I looked back at her, and something passed between us that didn't require words. We'd been working alongside each other long enough that most of the important things we didn't have to say out loud. I unloaded my pack in the barn. I got Chalk and Duff bedded and fed, and I stood in the barn for a few minutes in the dark, listening to them settle and blow before I went inside. I ate my supper and listened to Hattie talk to Ada about the town, about what positions were available, about the schoolhouse that needed a second teacher now that Mrs. Pryor had gone back east to her sister. Ada listened with her hands around a tin cup and answered every question steady and considered. No weeping. No helplessness. She'd used all that up, I think, out there on the fence rail. What was left was just her, the bare structure of her, bones and sense, and the particular quiet that belongs to people who have been through something real and come out the other side still upright. Hattie gave her the back room off the kitchen. I went up to my cot. I lay there and looked at the ceiling and listened to the wind work at the shutters and thought about Perry Hollowell's hand on Ada's face, about a ring sold for drinking money, about a flour sack on a fence rail in the snow. She stayed through the winter. She took the teaching position and proved herself capable within a week. The parents of Morrow's Crossing talked about her the way people talk about a good tool, with the quiet satisfaction of a thing that works the way it's supposed to. She had a manner in the classroom, Hattie told me, that was firm without being hard. The children learned. The parents were satisfied. The school board paid her without complaint. She helped Hattie in the evenings with the store accounts because she could cipher better than most, and Hattie's eyes had been going bad since the previous year. She found a way to tell Hattie this, that her eyes were the problem, not her mind, that didn't wound the older woman's pride, which was its own kind of skill. I trapped. I came in off the mountain every 2 or 3 weeks with a pack and spent a few days at the post resupplying and repairing gear, and then went back up. It was the shape of my life. It didn't change much. Except I found myself, those few days in town, staying closer to the post than I used to. I told myself it was the cold, that my bones were getting old, and the warmth of the building was better than standing around in yards and alleys. I told myself that for a few weeks, and I mostly believed it, and then I stopped bothering to explain it to myself. Ada was careful with me. She said good morning and good evening. She asked about the line, about conditions up high, about whether the snow was easy or hard that season. She asked because she genuinely wanted to know. I could tell the difference between courtesy and interest. She had been raised near people who worked the land and the wild, and she understood that it wasn't romantic, that it was labor, that it wore a man down in some ways and built him in others. She didn't pretty it up when she talked about it, and she didn't diminish it either. One evening in early February, she came and sat across from me at the table near the store's wood stove, and put down a plate of biscuits without asking if I wanted any and said, "Perry Hollowell was in town today." I looked at her. "He came to the schoolhouse." She kept her voice even. "After the children had gone home, he said Court left something behind that belonged to the family and he wanted it back." She let that settle for a moment. "He meant me." I pushed back from the table. She put her hand up. "Let me finish." She waited until I settled. "I told him that if he put a hand on me, I'd take the fireplace poker to his skull, and I meant it. He believed me, I think." Small pause. "But he'll be back. He's that kind of man." I looked at her. There was no trembling in her. She was angry, but it was the clean, contained anger of a person who has decided exactly how much of themselves they'll give to a thing, and not 1 degree more. "Did he touch you?" "No." "All right." She held my eyes. "Don't do something that lands you in front of a judge." "I won't." I put on my coat. "But I'm going to find Perry Hollowell and say something to him." "What?" I thought about how to say it. I said that this is my last trip up the mountain this season, that I'll be in town from here out more than I'm not, that he ought to keep that in mind. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that I didn't quite have a name for, not relief, not surprise, something older and quieter than either. Like a person who has been carrying a load alone for a very long time and has just been told they don't have to anymore. She said, "You don't owe me anything." I said, "I know it." "Then why?" I picked up my hat. I said, "Because the ring's gone and your husband's gone and his family wronged you and nobody else is going to say so to Perry Hollowell's face. So I will." I found Perry at the Granger's saloon on the north end of town. He was at the bar with a man named Ruddock who hired on at the Hollowell cattle in summer and did other things in between that weren't worth hiring on for. I came in out of the cold and I let the door close behind me and I didn't raise my voice. I said, "Perry." He turned. He was a big man, Perry, running to belly now at 40-something, but still big through the shoulders, and still carrying himself like a man who was used to being the largest thing in the room. He looked at me the way men like him look at someone they've decided not to be worried about. I said, "Ada Hollowell isn't property and she isn't a Hollowell anymore. Her husband's dead and his family's debt to her is considerable. You go near her again, near the schoolhouse, near this post, near her on the street, I'll make it my business. You understand what I'm saying to you?" Perry looked at Ruddock. Ruddock looked at the bar. Perry looked back at me. He said, "She send you." I said, "Nobody sent me." He looked at me different then, slower, trying to work out the angle, because men like Perry Hollowell can't quite get their minds around the idea of a man doing something he believes is right without a percentage in it somewhere. He said, "She's just a woman, Brant. Court's gone and Amos has a right to the—" I said, "You've got no right to her. I'm done explaining it." I held his eyes until he looked down at his glass. Then I left. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody in the saloon cheered. Ruddock stared at his boots. Perry Hollowell sat with his drink and didn't get up. But I'd spent 16 years reading what men were made of in the back country, who would hold when the weather turned and who would fold, who would do what they said and who was all bluster and bad air, and I knew from looking at him that Perry wouldn't push it. Bullies work in the dark and on the weak. I just made clear that Ada was neither anymore, or at least not alone in it. I walked back to the post in the cold, and I didn't feel like talking about what had happened, and Hattie, who knew the difference between the kind of silence that needed tending and the kind that needed leaving alone, didn't ask. Spring came slow that year, the way springs do in high country, 2 weeks of thaw, and then a hard freeze, and then mud, and then one morning you woke up and the meadows were greening up and the creek ran high and brown with snowmelt, and you didn't know exactly when the shift had happened. I went back up the mountain in March to clear my line for the coming season, and I was up there 6 weeks. 6 weeks is not a long time when you're in the pattern of it. I'd gone longer. I'd gone up in November and not come down until April, and it hadn't felt like much. This time I counted it. I'd catch myself doing it at odd moments, tallying the days the way a man counts something he's not sure is going to be there when he gets back. I told myself it was the shoulder, which had been bad through the coldest part of winter, and which I was glad to have the high country's dry cold for. I told myself it was any number of things, and I was moderately convincing, and then I stopped arguing about it with myself and just kept working my line. I came down in late April with a modest pack, not a bad season, but not a great one either, and I was thinking about coffee and Hattie's bread, and I was thinking about Ada without letting myself think about Ada, which is its own kind of thinking. You can spend a lot of energy not thinking about a thing. I put up chalk and duff and I went into the post, and Hattie was at the counter sorting a box of dry goods, and she looked up and said, "She's out back." I said, "Who is?" Hattie gave me the look she reserved for people who weren't worth arguing with. I went through the kitchen and out the back door. Ada was in the kitchen garden. She'd started the moment the ground was workable, turning soil with a spade in the afternoon light. She had dirt on her hands and her sleeves pushed up to the elbows and her hair coming loose of its braid where she'd been pushing it back. She heard the door and she looked up, and she stood there with the spade in both hands. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "You're thin." I said, "It was a long winter up high." She turned back to the garden and worked the spade in once more, then drove it into the ground and left it standing. She wiped her hands on her apron. She said, "Perry Hollowell left the valley in March, took Ruddock with him, said he was going to Colorado. Word from Deering is he's working a mine camp somewhere east of Leadville." I said, "I didn't know that." "Didn't figure you would up there." She looked at me. "Amos died in February. His heart." I said, "All right." She said, "Deke went to his sister's people in Kansas. There's nobody left here." A small pause. "You hungry?" I said, "Yes." She made supper. Not Hattie, Ada. Hattie sat with us at the table and ate and talked about the town, about the new family up from Kansas who'd taken the prior place, about the spring planting and how the creek was running higher than usual and would bear watching. Ada and I spoke when spoken to and ate and listened. We didn't look at each other directly very much, which is its own kind of looking. After supper, Hattie found some reason to be in the store, a shipment that needed sorting, a ledger she'd left open on the counter. and Ada and I were at the table with the lamp between us and the night outside. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said in February." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The part where you said nobody else was going to say it to Perry Hollowell's face, so you would." She looked at the lamp for a moment. "I've been thinking about what kind of man says that, the why of it." I said, "I told you the reason." "You told me the reason. I'm talking about the why underneath." I looked at her. She looked back at me the same way she always looked, that direct, searching attention that I had come to understand was not aggression or challenge, but its opposite. It was the way she looked at things she respected. It was how she looked at the work she cared about. I said, "I don't know how to talk about that kind of thing." She said, "I know, I've noticed." A pause. "You could try anyway." I thought about Helena, about how long it had been since a woman sat across a table from me in lamplight and wanted to know what was inside me, not just what I could do or what I could provide. I said, "When I found you on that fence rail, you'd already made your decision. You weren't going to beg and you weren't going to break. That was visible in you from 20 yards away." I stopped, started again. A person who still has that much left in them after what they'd been through, I don't know, it seemed worth protecting. She was quiet. She said, "Nobody has said something like that to me in a long time." I said, "I mean it plain. I looked for the words and they weren't quite there. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean." "I know that too." She looked at the lamp, then at me. "Court was a good man, he was, but he was sick more than he was well and his family was a weight, and I spent 3 years being very careful about what I wanted because there wasn't room for it." She folded her hands on the table. "There's room now." The wind moved outside. The lamp shifted a little and steadied. I looked at her hands on the table, and I thought about the flour sack at her feet on the fence rail, and the 2 fists in the back of my coat as we rode south in the snow. I said, "I'm 44 years old, and I smell like a trapping camp most of the year." She said, "I'm 31, and I've got a dead husband and no ring and no family, and I teach other people's children 5 days a week." I said, "I'm saying I'm not much." She said, "I'm saying neither am I by the usual measure." She looked at me. "But I don't think you've been going by the usual measure your whole life, Lyle." I didn't have an answer for that. I sat with it. The way you sit with a thing in the mountains when you don't know exactly what it is yet and you don't want to scare it off. You don't chase it and you don't grab at it. You let it get used to you. She didn't push. She sat with it too. That was when I knew. Not what I was going to do about it, that would take longer, and I was a man who didn't move fast on things that mattered. But what she was. Summer. I ran a shorter line that season, closer to the valley, and came in twice a month instead of every 3 weeks. I told myself it was because I was getting older, and the high passes were harder on my knees than they used to be. Hattie heard me say this to Chalk in the barn one morning. I talked to Chalk. I always have. It's one of the advantages of spending most of your life alone. And she came to the barn doorway and made a sound through her nose that conveyed her full opinion without a single word. I brought Ada things when I came in, not grand things. A piece of blue-gray stone I found above the timber line that had a color in it I'd never seen before in any stone anywhere and couldn't explain. A bundle of gooseberries from an early south-facing draw, still firm, not quite ripe, which she said was fine and made a sauce from and put on pork, and didn't tell me what she'd used them for until after I'd eaten it. Once a fox kit, too young and too lost, that I found shivering at the base of a spruce and couldn't leave. She kept it in a box behind the stove and fed it warm broth with a rag, and when it was old enough she carried it out to the meadow east of town and set it down in the grass, and we watched it stand there for a moment, disoriented, and then catch a scent of something and go. Neither of us said anything about it. We walked back to the post, and neither of us said anything about that either, and that was all right. She walked with me in the evenings when the day had cooled enough. She had a long stride for a woman her height. She didn't mince along or wait to be led. She moved like someone who knew where they were going and was confident of their right to get there, which I'd noticed about her from the very first night at the post. The way she'd come to the table and sat down and answered Hattie's questions like she was in a place she had as much right to as anyone. She didn't fill silence because she was uncomfortable with it. She only spoke when she had something worth saying, and I found that the evenings I liked best were the ones where we went half a mile or more without either of us saying a word, just walking along the creek in the late light with the meadows opening up to the south and the mountains going purple in the distance. She told me about her father one of those evenings. He had been a timber man in Missouri, careful, patient, the kind of man who taught by showing rather than explaining, who'd put a drawknife in her 8-year-old hands and guided her through the first stroke of it, and then let her figure out the rest. She said she still thought in the grain of things, that when she tried to understand a student, or a problem, or a person, she found herself looking for which way the grain ran before she tried to do anything about it. I thought that was a good way to think, and I told her so. She said her father died of a lung ailment when she was 16 and her mother had remarried quickly to a man who wasn't cruel but wasn't warm, and she'd left home as soon as she decently could, and she didn't regret it. She said that clearly, no regret, and I believed her. She wasn't the kind of woman who looked backward and wished. She looked at what was in front of her and decided what to do about it. I told her about Helena one night toward the end of summer, when we'd gone out to the east meadow in the cool after supper and sat on the fence rail at the edge of the grass. It was the first time I'd said Helena's name to another living person in years. I'd said it once to Chalk, in the dark of the barn, talking out loud the way you do when you're alone enough that it doesn't embarrass you. But that wasn't the same thing. I told Ada what Helena had been like, warm and sharp, not easy to fool, with a kind of directness that caught you off guard because she didn't announce it. I told her what had happened in the spring of '61, the childbed fever, how fast it moved and how little you could do when it started. How the house felt after, the particular weight of a place where someone had been and wasn't anymore. I told her how long it had taken me to be able to walk into a house where a woman had her things arranged without feeling the absence of it. I told her more than I'd planned to. That was her effect on me, her quietness when I talked, her genuine interest, the complete absence of any need to steer me toward what she wanted to hear. Ada listened to all of it. She didn't tell me she was sorry. She'd been sorry herself too recently for the word to come cheap. She said, "What was she like to talk to?" I thought about it properly, not the easy answer, the real one. I said, "Like you." She didn't waste words, and she didn't say what she didn't mean, and she didn't look away from hard things. Ada was quiet for a moment. The meadow grass moved in the evening wind. There were swallows working the field, low over the grass, quick and purposeful. She said, "That's a kind thing to say." I said, "It's a true thing." We sat on the fence rail in the cooling dark until the stars came out over the eastern ridge, and then we walked back to the post in the last of the light, and neither of us said anything, and I thought about the shape of my life, the long years of it, alone and sufficient and all right, and I thought that all right was not the same thing as good, not even close. And I held that thought carefully, the way you hold something that changes the map you've been using, and I didn't try to put it down. Autumn again. The valley turned gold and the nights came early, and I started laying out my gear for the high country, the established pattern of my life, each piece of equipment inspected and either repaired or replaced, nothing left to chance. Boots, traps, oil for the rifle, the pack frame checked at every joint, the canvas bags gone over seam by seam. Ada came into the barn one afternoon while I was going over Chalk's front feet with the farrier's rasp. She stood in the doorway with the light behind her and crossed her arms and watched me work the way she watched things she was thinking about. She said, "When do you go?" I said, "Week, maybe 10 days, depending on weather." She said, "And you'll be up there until February." I said, "Usually the middle of February, yes." She said, "All right." She looked at Chalk's profile for a moment. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to hear it clear and not dodge around it." I set down the rasp. I stood up. She said, "I know what you are. You're a man who lives in the high country and comes down when the season closes. I'm not asking you to change that. I'm not asking you to give up the mountain." She held my eyes. "I'm asking whether what's here when you come down, whether I'm part of it. Whether you want that to be what you're coming back to." She said it the way she said everything that mattered, without armor, without angles, without softening it to protect herself if it went wrong. She just put it out there plain and waited with that direct, serious patience. I looked at her. I thought about what I'd said in February and what she'd said back, and the 6 months of evenings and walks and small brought things between then and this afternoon, and how the map had changed. I said, "Ada." I stopped. I tried again. "I've been working up to saying something to you since April and I can't seem to get it right." She said, "Then say it wrong." I said, "I want you. I want to know you're here when I come back, and I want to come back to you specifically, and I stopped. "I want to be the man you stay with, not because your options ran out, because you choose it." She walked across the barn. She walked right up to me and she put both hands flat on my chest and looked up at me and she said, "I already have." Her hands on my chest. That's what I carry from that moment. The weight and warmth of them right through my shirt, deliberate, like she was taking stock of something and finding it exactly what she'd expected to find. No ceremony in it, no performance, just her being clear. I put my arms around her and she let her forehead rest against my shoulder, and we stood like that in the barn with Chalk watching us with his particular long-suffering horse patience, and the smell of hay and leather, and the dry cold of early autumn coming in through the gap in the wall, and I thought, here, this, after everything that went the wrong way, here is a thing that goes right. I said into her hair, "I'm still going up the mountain." She said, "I know you are." I said, "I'll be back in February." She said, "I'll be here." I went up the mountain. Same mountain it had always been. The cold, the silence, the clean daily work of checking the line and resetting traps and reading weather and moving camp when the animals moved. The slow accumulation of days. The particular beauty of the high country in deep winter when everything was simplified down to the necessary: fire, food, shelter, the line. I'd spent 23 years finding comfort in that simplicity, and I still did. I'm not saying it changed. But there was something different running underneath it. Something I checked on occasionally the way you check on a cache, just confirming it was still there, intact, undisturbed. "Ada," her hands flat on my chest, "I already have." The first 2 weeks up high I moved fast, getting the line set before the real snows locked the upper draws. 14 miles of country, roughly, from the lower timber through 2 alpine basins and back around by the North Ridge. I knew every foot of it. The deadfall across the creek at the second bend that you had to dismount to get over. The rock outcropping on the east face of the first basin that held heat from the afternoon sun, and where you could camp even in cold that would kill you anywhere else in the open. The particular way the wind came down the North Ridge in a storm, not steady but in pulses, like something breathing. I'd learned all of it over 16 years, season by season, the way you learn anything that matters slow, with the full cost of your attention. At night I ate and sat by the fire and I thought. The mountain gave you that. There was nothing to push the thinking away with up here, no other voices, no business to transact, no decisions that could be put off until tomorrow. Just the fire and the cold, and what was in you. I thought about Perry Hollowell, about the certainty he'd had standing in that schoolhouse doorway, the particular certainty of a certain kind of man, that a woman alone was available for whatever he wanted from her, that the absence of a husband made her fair game and nobody would say different. I thought about Ada threatening him with a fireplace poker and meaning it. I thought about her on the fence rail in the snow, the flour sack, the matter-of-fact way she'd said, "They sold my wedding ring." She'd handled every bit of it herself. She hadn't needed me to step in. She was the kind of woman who would have found her way regardless, too stubborn and too clear-eyed to be finished off by the Hollowell family or anyone else. What I'd done was stand beside her, said out loud, "You're not alone in this." Put my name to that in front of Perry Hollowell and in front of the town and meant it, and the town had seen that I meant it, and that it mattered in its quiet way, not because it changed what Ada was, but because it said something about what I was. I thought about the school board chairman asking me about trail conditions. I thought about the way Hattie's husband Roy shook my hand at the wedding and held it a moment longer than a formal handshake required, not saying anything, just holding it. I thought about the look on the faces of a few of the men in town when Ada took my arm on the street. Not envy exactly, something more like recognition. Like they'd seen something they'd expected to see and were satisfied that it was there. I'd been coming through Morrow's Crossing for 16 years, and in all that time I had been useful, reliable, fair in my trades, and largely invisible. A man passing through on his way somewhere else, even when somewhere else was just the mountain. Nobody had looked at me the way those men looked at me now. She'd done that, not by saying a word about me to anyone, just by choosing me in front of them. A man my age doesn't think too much about what he's worth. You get past a certain point and the question gets settled, or you decide it's settled, and you make your accommodations and you go on. I'd made mine. I was a capable man with a good line in good country, and I didn't owe anyone anything and nobody owed me. That was the deal, and I'd been satisfied with it. I hadn't counted on a woman who looked at what I was, the full picture of it, the age, the solitude, the shoulder that went bad in the cold, the pack that smelled of the mountain, and said, that's what I want, not despite those things, including them. I came down in February. Duff and Chalk were leaner than I'd have liked, and so was I hard winter above 5,000 feet. And my right shoulder had been bad since December from the old trap injury that always woke back up in the deep cold. I rode the last day in a wet snowfall that turned to sleet by afternoon, and I was tired in the kind of way that goes through all the layers of you and settles in the bone. I put up the animals. I washed up in the barn, which was warmer than the yard. I put on the clean shirt I kept rolled at the bottom of my saddle pack. I walked to the schoolhouse in the sleet. She was at the board erasing the day's work, her back to the door. The children were gone. The fire in the small iron stove was burning low and needed tending. She heard the door and she turned. She looked at me, that full, straight look taking the measure of me, checking what was there. She said, "You're limping." I said, "Shoulder. When it's bad I favor the right side and it changes my walk." She set down her eraser. She crossed the room and she put her hand on my face, her palm flat against my jaw, deliberate and warm, and she held it there. Just held it there, like she was confirming something she'd already known but wanted to feel for certain. I put my hand over hers. She said, "I have something on at Hattie's." I said, "All right." She said, "And after supper I want to talk to you about wintering in town. Not giving up the mountain, just coming in at first hard snow and going back up at thaw, the way other trappers work it." I said, "I've been thinking along those lines." She looked at me, the edge of something like a smile, which on Ada was different from a smile on another woman. It didn't spread wide, it just altered the quality of her expression slightly, like sunlight on water. She said, "Have you?" I said, "Since about October." She took her hand from my face and she put it through my arm, her hand in the crook of my elbow, easy and certain, like it had always been there, and we went out into the sleet. We married in April. Small thing in Hattie's store, with the Morrow family and the schoolchildren's parents, and the minister who came through on his circuit every 6 weeks. Ada wore a dress the color of sage that she'd made herself over the winter. She had a ring I'd had made by the silversmith in Deering, plain and wide, solid silver, nothing delicate about it, made to last, and to wear every day and not worry about. When I put it on her finger, she held her hand out and looked at it for a long moment, and I knew she was thinking about the other one. The one the Hollowell family had sold for drinking money. I knew it, and I didn't say anything about it because she didn't need me to. She was allowed to think about it. It was part of her story, and her story was real, and I didn't want to paper over any of it. She looked up at me and she said, "Well, all right then," which was the ceremony as far as she was concerned. The minister said the words, and we answered them, and Hattie cried, and tried not to let anyone see her doing it, which everyone saw. We went on living. I ran the shorter line from then out. Mountain line, close to the valley down before the hard snows. It wasn't what I'd done before, and it took some adjusting, not the line itself, which was work I knew, but the coming in. The putting down of the solitary self. You get used to a life, and the shape of it becomes part of you, and changing it isn't nothing, even when you chose the change and would choose it again. But I'd come down in October now and not go back up until March, and in those months I learned what it was to live inside a life rather than beside one. Ada taught her school. I kept the post's equipment in repair, which Hattie needed more than she'd let on. She'd been making do with a cracked bellows, a water barrel with a seam beginning to split, and hinges on the storeroom door that screamed every time someone opened it, and had been screaming since before I first came through. I fixed all of it in the first week, and I could hear Hattie not saying anything about how long it had needed doing. In the evenings Ada did her accounts and her lesson plans, and sometimes she read and sometimes we just sat. And I built things, small necessary things. A shelf for her school books, a better lock for the barn door, a wooden box with a fitted lid for her teaching supplies, a footstool for the reading chair where she tucked her feet under her in a way that told me the floor was cold on that side of the room. I fixed the floor on that side of the room. It was good work. The kind of work that asks nothing dramatic of you and asks it every day, which is a different kind of hard, the kind that builds rather than erodes. I'd been a man without a household to tend for long enough that I'd forgotten what it was to feel a place grow sturdier under your hands. To wake up in the morning and see the things you'd made still standing there, doing their job. Some evenings Ada would look up from her book and say something. About one of her students, a boy named Caleb who was bright but suspicious of it, who needed to believe that being smart was useful before he'd let himself be either, or something she'd read that had gotten under her skin, or something she'd been working out in her head for days and had finally gotten to a position on. She had a mind that moved carefully and didn't rush to conclusions and wasn't embarrassed by saying I don't know yet. I liked that. I'd spent my life around the mountain, which demanded that kind of thinking or punished you for not having it, and it was rare to find it in a person who'd learned it somewhere else. I said what I thought when I had something to say, and she took it straight, without filtering it through what she wanted to hear. When she disagreed, she said so, and when I was right, she said that too, and neither one felt remarkable coming from her, which was what made it remarkable. That was rare. I hadn't known how rare until I had it every day. I noticed that first winter together, the shift in how the town saw us. Nothing was said directly. That wasn't how Morrow's Crossing worked, not about things that mattered. But the school board chairman, who'd never once asked me anything of consequence in all the years I'd been coming through, started asking about trail conditions and the snowpack, and what I thought the spring runoff would do to the lower creek crossing. He asked the way you ask a man you've decided has something worth knowing. I answered the same as I would have answered anyone, but I noticed it. I thought about what Ada had said that night in April, around the lamp. I don't think you've been going by the usual measure your whole life, Lyle. I thought about what it meant that a woman had seen that, when I hadn't asked anyone to look, hadn't announced it or argued for it or even been sure of it myself. There's a morning I go back to. First autumn after we married. I was putting together my kit for the upper country, the familiar work of it, checking each piece against the list I kept in my head, and Ada came out to the barn before first light. She didn't usually do that. She brought coffee, which she set on the top rail of the stall, and she leaned against the gate and watched me work and didn't say anything. I worked. I checked the pack frame at every joint, the way I always did. I went over the traps. I resupplied the kit. I went over Chalk's shoes one more time because I always did before a long stretch. When I was done, I led Duff out and tied off the lead and picked up my coffee, which had gone lukewarm, and drank it. The sky was just graying up in the east. The first frost of the year was on the grass. Ada stood in the yard and she looked at me with the mountains behind me, the big dark shapes of them in the pre-dawn, the first snow already on the upper ridges, and she said, "Come back." Just that, come back. Not be careful, not right when you can, not don't be too long. Come back. Like it was an instruction she had every confidence I would execute, and she was merely making the requirement plain. I said, "I will." She nodded once. She stepped forward and she put her hand on my chest, flat and deliberate, the way she always did, taking stock of something, confirming it was solid, and then she stepped back. I rode out. I went up the mountain and I ran my line, and I worked through the cold and the short days and the long nights and the shoulder and the bad weather that came in November 2 weeks early, and pushed me down to the lower camp for a week and a half while it blew itself out. And every time it got hard, not hard enough to quit, just hard enough that the question passed through your mind, I thought about that. Come back. The flat weight of her hand. The certainty she had in me, plain as a clear day, not dressed up in anything. That's a thing a man can carry. Not light, but not heavy either. The right kind of weight, the kind that keeps you level in bad terrain. I am not a man people noticed much. I worked alone in the backcountry for 16 years, and I came in when the season closed, and I didn't make a fuss, and I didn't ask for anything, and the town went on around me, and that had been all right. I knew what I was and what I could do and what I couldn't, and I'd long since stopped expecting to be surprised by any of those things. What I hadn't expected was what my worth looked like through someone else's eyes. Ada showed me that. Not by telling me. She wasn't a woman who wasted words on things that could be shown. By the way she looked when I came through the door after a long stretch up high. By the hand on my face in the schoolhouse. By the way she kept on asking me about the mountain, the conditions, the particular country I worked, in a way that told me she was building a picture of it, that she wanted to know the thing I spent half my life inside of because it was mine, and she cared about what was mine. By the way she said, "Come back," like my coming back was a fixed point she was orienting everything else from. I came back. Every season, every time I said I would. And every time I came through that door, she looked up from whatever she was doing, the lesson plan, the accounts, the book, whatever it was, and she looked at me. Really looked. That full, straight attention. And there it was again. I'd spent 44 years building something worth being, something solid and capable. A man who didn't break and didn't flinch, and did what he said he'd do in the country that didn't forgive you for doing otherwise. I'd built it in the quiet, without an audience, without anyone to see whether it amounted to anything, and most of the time I hadn't asked whether it did. You do the work. The work is its own justification. That was how I thought about it, and I thought I'd always think about it that way. But there's a difference between the work being enough and the work being seen. I hadn't let myself know that quite. I'd gotten very good at not letting myself know it. She saw it. Not once, not as a gesture, but every morning and every evening and every time I came back down the mountain, steady as the mountain itself. The way she took my arm on the street, and the way she sat across the table from me, and the way she put her hand flat on my chest. I see what you are, and I chose it, and I'm still here. For a man who'd gone 23 years without anyone seeing him that clearly, for a man who'd made his peace with being useful and capable, and otherwise invisible, that was not a small thing. That was everything. The lamp between us that first April night. The ring on her finger that I put there myself. Her hand through my arm walking back through the sleet from the schoolhouse, easy and certain, like it belonged there. The blue stone on the sill of our window that she never moved, that she polished sometimes when she was thinking. Come back. I did. Every time. I still do.